Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Raw podcast brought to you by the Sunderland Echo. James, Joe, and Phil with you today as we head into the international break. We're just going to have a little discussion on some news lines that have occurred regarding Sunderland in the past couple of weeks. First on the agenda, Phil, the shareholding changes at the club. Stewart Donald reduced, Kira Louis-Dreyfus and Juan Sartori increased. Very minor, but what do you think that means, and what should Sunderland fans expect going forward?
Yeah, I think it's not a huge event in of itself. I think it just it's another kind of stage. I think of a longer term process really, which is I think sort of Kirill Dreyfus with Juan Sartori as a supporting figure, if you like, sort of assuming that full responsibility for the club. I think Stewart Donald obviously did an interview with BBC Radio Solent last weekend, in which he made pretty clear that he's hoping in the sort of short to medium term to return to Eastleigh, which I think as a club he's, without being directly involved in, obviously he's still very close to his heart and still attends games. And I think he still has a strong relationship with the shareholders there. If you look at the EFL rules, I know Eastleigh you're in the National League, but thinking sort of longer term, it does prohibit you having an interest in terms of shareholding in two clubs if it's above 10%. So theoretically, that could be an important step for him. More broadly, I think it's probably a reflection of the fact that the more this journey goes on, the greater the financial commitments become in terms of the investment that's required from the shareholders. I think it was always likely to be a long-term process where Kirill and Juan took on more shares. Obviously, as per the shareholder agreement, whenever money goes into the club, it goes in proportionately in terms of who owns what shares. So this just reduces the financial commitment that Stewart Donald has towards Sunderland. And that's obviously, I think, significant as hopefully the investment and the ambition gets greater and greater the closer Sunderland get to the Premier League. So one interesting thing that Stewart Donald did allude to in his interview is he kind of suggested he's not looking to get rid of that 9% anytime soon. I assume that's because if Sunderland do eventually get the Premier League, those shares become quite lucrative. So I'm sure that's a factor in that. So yeah, I don't think it necessarily changes a huge amount in terms of Sunderland's day-to-day operation, if anything. But I think it reflects the longer term trajectory of what's happening with Sunderland's ownership, which is, the Kirill with Juan as a sort of fairly quiet supporting partner is the future of the club, and this is just another stage on that process.
Absolutely, a good summary there, Phil, of how the football club is run and Donald's involvement or lack of involvement, obviously, because he's such a minor stakeholder now. And obviously what he said recently, you can read those quotes on the Sunderland Echo website from Stewart Donald via BBC Radio Solent. Joe, obviously Donald's continued ownership, even though minor in Sunderland, doesn't have any bearing on the sort of day-to-day running of the club. It is a little bit of an annoyance, given the history with Sunderland fans and how Sunderland fans perceive Stewart Donald, that he is still involved. I don't think it's necessarily something that Sunderland fans should be worried about short-term. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think what we're seeing is kind of the slowly squeezing out of Donald's role in the club. I think it's significant with that. Now that he's got the 9% that he can now go back in at Eastleigh, it's obviously a key factor behind kind of the decision. And I think, as Phil alluded to, that it's not going to change too much kind of the runnings at Sunderland. Kira Louis-Dreyfus is already the majority shareholder, and that 51% that we saw in the summer that he got seemed quite significant for him to kind of take day-to-day control of the club. Although Stewart Donald wasn't already on the board when Kira Louis-Dreyfus did kind of buy it was 41%, wasn't it, at first, his shares. So kind of this latest development, probably we're not going to see too big a change, but with Donald still owning that 9%, as Phil mentioned as well, that seems significant because if Sunderland do go up to the Premier League, that figure is going to increase significantly the value of Sunderland as a club. I spoke to football finance expert Kieran Maguire the other day, and he was saying that as a championship club, Sunderland are probably worth between 50 to 60 million. Now, if they were to go up to the Premier League, that's going to increase probably by 100 million. So you can see that kind of how significant that step up is. in terms of price from a club getting promoted from the Championship to the Premier League. So that would obviously be an incentive to kind of keep shares in Sunderland. And with the 9% that Donald still owns, he can go back in at Eastleigh and have an influence there.
I think, Phil, for me, the more interesting question, the more pressing question, perhaps, in terms of Sunderland's long-term future would be Juan Sartori's role. Obviously, he's increased his shareholding again, but we know he has political aspirations back in Uruguay. Also on the board at Monaco, which his stepfather, I believe, owns. So it's not all that clear how in he is with Sunderland, really. Obviously, we know Kirill Louis-Dreyfus is responsible for the majority of those shares and most involved with the day-to-day running. But that Juan Sartori question is something that's been with the club since the Madrox era in terms of his role and not really been that clear. Is that something you would expect to become more clear eventually?
Possibly. I think there's probably a little bit of a clearer picture at the moment than there was in that initial Madrox era, because if you remember, during the Madrox era, it was something that seemed to be whenever things weren't going so well or there was questions being asked, Juan was sort of the person. He was almost the night waiting in the wings, wasn't it? It was always, well, you'll see Juan coming on board more, you'll see. And obviously that was part of this general erosion of trust, I think, between fans and the ownership, because at the same time this was being said by people on Weir's side involved with the club, we could see Juan, campaigning to be a president or senator in Uruguay. So there was an obvious gap between what we were being told about Juan, which was someone who's going to get more and more involved, more and more committed, going to have more and more of an input, and what was seemed to be actually happening in reality. I think it's a little bit different this time around, because I think there's been a bit more clarity from Kirill in terms of Juan being very much a quiet supporting partner to what he does, rather than being actively involved. I was at a meeting with Kirill with the Red and White Army when he did talking down at Poprex sort of late last year, and he was asked about Juan's role, and he said that at times it's been really beneficial because Juan's been able to, his contacts through Monaco in the French game, he's been able to almost sort of pull some resources and discuss in terms of some potential transfer targets that Sunderland had. I know the pair of them have been on a bit of a tour, haven't they, in South America last year, where they visited clubs and stuff. So I think that I don't think Juan is being set up for a huge role beyond, someone who knows Kirill and being a supportive voice, if you like, and potentially that sort of networking, if you like. I think that's what Juan's role is, and I think we can expect that to continue. Obviously, in terms of the financial commitment, I think that's probably going to be a question in terms of both of them in the next 3 to 4 years, because obviously at some point, Sunderland fans are going to rightly expect this consolidation to move into something a little bit more ambitious in terms of pushing to get back to the Premier League where the club wants to be. We know that sort of player sales and investing money and growing income and being sustainable is part of that, but obviously that question of the financial commitment is going to grow. So I see that being a bigger question, if you like, than Juan's role within itself, because I think the narrative for a while now has very much been Juan isn't involved day to day at Sunderland. Do you know what I mean? In terms of the actual running, he's an ally of what Kirill's trying to do. He likes being involved, and almost like a supporting partner is probably how I would describe it, and I think that's how it will be going forward as well.
I must say, I have to mention it, Phil, but seeing on Louis Dreyfus's Instagram that he was cutting around Venice in Sunderland shorts did amuse me, in a good way.
Yeah.
So he's clearly all in. That must mean he's all in.
Yeah, I think he carried it off better than you or I would. I think that's fair to say.
Absolutely. We'll move on to more recent news. Joe, the news came last night that Dan Neil had signed a new contract at Sunderland, a 1-year extension on his deal already, which takes him to 2026. You would imagine that that's really good for the club in terms of security long term.
I think so, and we've seen that the club have been quite proactive with contracts, haven't we? We saw last season they did give a longer term contract to Dan Neil anyway. That was to 2025. Now we've seen them extend that by an extra year to 2026. We saw them give Elliot Embleton a new deal. Anthony Patterson signed a new deal in the summer. Corey Evans signed one a couple of weeks ago, didn't he? So I think we'll get into the summer now, and there's only Carl Winchester is the only Sunderland player that will be out of contract. So that kind of shows that they've got their kind of long term kind of plans in place. But to get Dan Neil tied down, I think it's clearly a very important piece of business. He's clearly a player that will have attracted interest probably from Premier League clubs that have been keeping an eye on him. It's easy to forget, really. He's still only, is he 21 or 22? He's still quite a very young player, and he's become such a key player in this Sunderland side, partly because of injuries and Sunderland not having other options in that position, but partly just the fact that he's stepped up to the Championship pretty impressively from last season, where in the second half of the campaign in League One, he wasn't playing regularly when Sunderland won promotion. So, and he's had to also learn a new role in recent weeks, kind of that holding midfield role. Because Corey Evans hasn't been available, he's had to step into that role. And spoke to him a couple of weeks ago, and he was saying that he's actually the oldest player, the oldest central midfield player in the squad at the minute, because of other players not being available or the club not being able to sign an extra player in that position. So, although he has made mistakes this season and there has been some difficult games for him when he's had to play in that role, I think the way he stepped up to the Championship this season has been really impressive and looks like a player with a really bright future.
Yeah, absolutely. I love Dan Neil. I think he's great. He's a really nice bloke to talk to when you do get the chance to interview him. I thought his mentality after being dropped by Alex Neil was superb. I think he did an interview recently where he said that his question was, how do I get back in to the team under Alex Neil? You know, he didn't sulk. He just wanted to become what Alex Neil wanted him to become, because Alex Neil was the manager of the team. I thought that was a cracking mentality. He is only 21, as you mentioned, Joe. 2 full seasons playing at the club, so this is only his second season in senior football, which is a massive achievement. And Phil, he's made 95 appearances for Sunderland in all competitions already. Over League Cup, FA Cup, Championship, League One, and the Papa Johns. So he's a great player, and hopefully, fingers crossed, now will be at Sunderland for a long time to come as the club grows, which he's alluded to, obviously.
Yeah, definitely. I think that I think it's really sort of it's good news on a couple of fronts, really. I think one, Premier League clubs have been watching Dan Neil for a long time, and I'm sure there would have been interest there in the summer, and this almost heads that off at the pass, really. I say it a lot when I talk about Dan Neil. We look at all the players who left the club for understandable reasons, really, from his age group or around his age group for big Premier League academies when the club was in League One, and maybe with the direction was quite uncertain. Dan Neil decided he didn't want to do that because he was genuinely determined to get Sunderland out of League One and be a part of the club's history, which, it's not a dig at the other players, because I think given where the club was, we all understood why they made those decisions that they did. And for a lot of them, it's working out, playing in the Premier League or knocking on the door playing in the Premier League. But I think this, again, just shows you Neil's loyalty to the club, really, and how determined he is to put it back where it's belonging. He's already done a huge part of that. If you look at the last 2 seasons, including this one, where it's moved to in that time, and his role at the heart of it is amazing. But the other thing is that he is ambitious, and I know he will have Premier League ambitions, and I know that he will want to maximise his potential as a footballer. And him signing this contract shows that he believes he can do that here. And obviously it's sort of the pressure is on Sunderland, really, with all these young players, not just Neil, players like Anthony Patterson, to make sure they grow fast enough that they go to the Premier League with Sunderland and not with another club. But I think it's a sign of faith from him, really, as well, in the club, that he believes it's making the right progress and that the ambition is there to get to the Premier League, because I have no doubt he will get there eventually. And if Sunderland can't get there quick enough, he'll go there with somebody else. But if that happens, I'm sure he'll have played a pretty central role in moving it a huge way forward from when he first broke into the team. So yeah, I think it's really good news. And yeah, like Joe says, he's had an excellent season. There have been some sort of errors along the way and stuff, but when you consider, if anyone had said to us when he first broke through the team, he'd play as a holding midfielder in the Championship with very little protection in front of him, I don't think we would have believed that was possible. So yeah, it hasn't always been perfect, but the fact that he's been able to do it, very well on the main is huge testament to his ability to improve, really, and learn.
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely a good step in the right direction. We'll talk about Ross Stewart next. I found it amusing on social media after Dan Neil's contract was announced. The talk immediately turned towards Ross Stewart, which I guess is testament to how desperate Sunderland fans are to see that contract signed and announced. Phil, what's the situation? Obviously, Ross Stewart with a season-ending injury now, which may have put the brakes on things a little bit.
Yeah, I think it is worth saying as well. You're right in what you say about the Stewart thing. And generally speaking, since Christian Speakman came in, since Kevin Dreyfus came in, the club been pretty good with contract management. Joe made that point there about only Winchester being out of contract this summer, and that's a huge step forward from where it was. And I think when we have these conversations, it's particularly about Stewart, we've got to be balanced. It's not usual for Sunderland to be allowing players to get towards the last year of their contract. It's something they've done really well. Yeah, as you say, I think talks has reached a bit of an impasse from my understanding, really, in terms of this is around the new year, I should say. I think both parties still want to get it done, but there was a pretty sizable gap, I think. And I think things had ground to a little bit of a halt. Stewart's obviously then had his injury and then has had to have surgery. That's obviously a very demanding period for him, and a lot to get his head around. So I wasn't necessarily expecting any movement, around that time. I think it's absolutely has to be a pressing priority again to try and get it done ahead of the summer. Because I know Stewart, obviously, him personally has to focus on his recovery, but you don't want one of your top assets going in the last year of your contract. It leaves you very vulnerable. I suppose the question is, will the change in circumstance in terms of the injury, in terms of Sunderland, hopefully looking ahead to kick on next season and really compete, will that be able to bring the two closer together in terms of what they want from the contract? I hope so. Because as I say, there did seem to be a bit of an impasse around the new year. So I'm hoping that alongside planning for the summer recruitment-wise, that's going to move back towards the top of the list as Stewart starts to sort of step up with his rehab. I do think I can understand that reaction from supporters because it gets more important, not less important, really, the closer we get to that final year.
Joe, you tend to do a lot of work on the Echo websites, looking at contracts and contract lengths. Are there any Sunderland players now that sort of Dan Neil's out the way, and besides Ross Stewart, that you're looking at thinking they could be next?
We're looking at the younger players. I think Dennis Serkin's probably the obvious one that stands out. I think he's got a contract till 2024. So this summer he'd be going into the final 12 months of his contract. So he's a player, obviously a young player that Sunderland have signed in League One. He's been a good asset for them, was a key player getting promoted from League One. And before his kind of concussion injury, which has been a concern over recent weeks, he was performing well in the Championship. So he's probably the obvious one. There'll probably be a few more that are out of contracts in 2024. Patrick Roberts being one of them, who's still obviously a good age at 26. He signed a 2-year contract extension, didn't he, in the summer. Lyndon Gooch and Luke O'Nien are two players that will be out of contracts at the end of next season as well. So there's a few players that you would probably look at and think that maybe you could look at tying them down to a new deal. But as we've mentioned before, a lot of the younger players that have come in have been tied down to 4 or 5 year contracts. So they are going to be assets for the football club long term. If they perform well, their value is obviously going to increase. And they're a good age that they can still improve. And if Sunderland can either sell them on or they can be a good asset for the club. So as we've mentioned earlier in the podcast, I think the club have done pretty well kind of with contracts recently, with bringing players in and then renewing contracts at the right time. But there are a few that maybe at the end of next season that they'll want to look at and maybe tie a few more players down.
The one I was thinking of, Phil, in particular, just because of how exceptional he is Dan Ballard. He signed a 3-year deal last summer, obviously, so it'd be last 2 years of his deal by this summer. Obviously, Sunderland have a bit of security on that with the length of time, but just thinking similar in terms of the Dan Neil, still got time left on his contract, but you might just want that extra year. I'm guessing that's one. Well, I suppose the Sunderland will always be reevaluating all contracts.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's a big part of their policy as well. When they feel a player's gone up a level, they get rewarded accordingly, and that's been a big part of it with Neil last year as well as this year. And both occasions when he signed a new deal, he hasn't had ages on his contract, but you could say it wasn't really a priority. But it was about recognising last year that he'd gone from being an academy player to a starting player every week in league.
We may have lost Phil Smith. Is he gone for you, Joe?
He's frozen on my screen, yeah.
He's frozen. Oh well. Do you want to pick up the gauntlet on that? Dan Ballard might be one that Sunderland look at.
Yeah, I think Dan Ballard for me has probably been signing of the season. Just trying to think of some of the other kind of contenders. He obviously had his foot injury at the start of the season and missed a large chunk of the season, but his performances the last few months, I think you can really see what a good sign he's been. And when he came in, he ticked a lot of boxes, didn't he? He was a good age at 23. He'd played 30-odd games in the Championship for Millwall. Burnley would have been interested in him to try and sign him from Arsenal. Sunderland managed to get that deal done when the deal to Burnley fell through. And yeah, I've been really impressed with him the last kind of few weeks. The fact that he's strong, he can physically stand up to the Championship, but he's also good on the ball. He can step out with it and pick a pass as well. So the fact that he's out of contract in 2025, that may seem kind of a bit down the line. But as we've seen with Dan Neil, Sunderland probably want to maybe tie him up, because I'm sure there'll be clubs from above that'll be looking and thinking, this guy can be a good asset for us. So yeah, I think you're right to kind of point that out and think that maybe he could be the next one that they're looking to target as the long-term deal.
Phil's back. Phil, do you want to pick up where you left off there?
I can't really remember what I was saying now. I think definitely it's a fair point. I doubt it's at the top of their list in terms of, I think Sirkin will certainly be one that they're looking at, because with 1 year left, that's not an ideal situation to be in. Stewart is obviously the big priority. So you mentioned Ballard. I doubt it's at the top of their list, but I also definitely think there will be that ongoing process of looking at all the players within the squad and saying, right, well, when we brought you in, you were in this status in the squad, and therefore you've been paid accordingly, but now you're at this level. So yeah, I think it's something that generally they've been pretty good at, and I think that will continue.
Indeed. A couple of other questions really surrounding Sunderland's current squad. There's been a bit of talk about Edouard Michu in the past couple of days. Reports suggesting Sunderland have a €2.5 million option to buy Michu from PSG. If they don't go up, it's €5 million. If they do, there's also been reports that Fulham in the Premier League are interested in the Frenchman. Phil, what do you reckon? Guessing Sunderland would probably be keen now, given Michu's performances, to make that deal permanent. But obviously, the Fulham question clouds the situation a bit.
Yeah, I think so. I'm not sure personally at this stage. I'd be looking too much at sort of perceived interest from elsewhere, because that the deal was done with that option to buy included, and so I would expect Sunderland to be in a pretty strong position. I think the question with Michu, it's not a question of is he worth that reported fee, and is he potentially going to be a big asset for Sunderland. I think it's obvious that he is. We're seeing him getting better and better from week to week. He's starting to make bigger contributions in the final third. He's starting to get the pace of the Championship. Do I think that's reported €2.5 million as a fair price for his talent? Do I think he could make a big return for Sunderland? Definitely, I do. But I think the question really is, it's very difficult to know for us to decide whether that's the right thing to do, because we don't know what Sunderland's budget is. And so the only reason I raise that is that we know that Sunderland need to sign at least one striker permanently this summer. We probably need them to sign a proper holding midfielder as well. Obviously, Ahmad's not going to be here. So I guess what I mean is, if that money was to use up the vast majority of the budget, would we say that was the best way to use it? Do you know what I mean? Because obviously, I think there's a huge onus to go and get a striker this summer, and that's where the vast majority of the money tends to go for most clubs. So
sorry, go on, Phil. Finish your point, and I'll come in.
No, I was just going to say. So, do I think that's a good deal for Michu, and do I think someone will want to do it? Yeah, I absolutely do. But I think it raises an interesting question about what the budget will be this summer, and whether that would be the absolute priority. I honestly don't know the answer to that question. I think it's imperative someone would go and invest in that forward line this summer. So that's the only sort of playing devil's advocate slightly I would point to. But I obviously think Michu could be a brilliant sign that value.
Just on a wider point, Phil, I'd like to get your opinion on this. But yes, Sunderland fans want to see a couple of strikers come in and various positions strengthened. But should they be concerned, perhaps, and I'm not saying let's splash the cash willy-nilly. No, I'm not saying that at all. I am all aboard the sustainability model, with an acceptance that at some point, a little bit of money will have to be spent. But should Sunderland fans be concerned if Michu is a player at €2.5 million that's not coming in at the expense of, another forward player? Because I know a lot of fans who would expect, and it's not an unreasonable expectation, that the club would be able to do both.
Yeah, I think they should be able to do both. I agree with that. I just think, obviously Sunderland's work to a budget, and I guess I'm just raising the question of, how would you view it if that budget wasn't going up massively this year, and signing Michu would take out a huge portion of that. I agree that it would be fair to expect that there should be the room to sign both this summer. Definitely. I suppose I'm just countering the perception that someone will definitely go and do it with Michu in the summer, because we don't know for certain at this stage that they will. I would like to think that they would do both, that they would, they've brought Michu in with a view to signing him if he kicks on, which he has done, and then go and invest in other areas of the pitch. I think that would be, really exciting. It's a big summer ahead, isn't it? Because I think that while there's been disappointment in recent weeks at how the season's ended, I think most people have accepted that, they wanted the club to survive this year, and they were content that it would be a consolidation. But obviously, with a club of this size, of 40,000 turn every week, it's not going to be like that forever. And that it is incumbent on the club to show that ambition. So I totally agree with your point.
For me, it just makes sense to sign Michu, given the interest. The talk when he came to the club was, I think he was mentioned as Sunderland's dream signing in terms of the recruitment team. We're really, really keen on him. He's come in. We've given him that first team experience. We've essentially developed a player. So to not sign him at the end of the season, if we had the means to be, would seem a bit silly, Joe, really. To be honest, I just think it just makes so much sense to sign him. He's a good player. He's developing. He's doing well. I think he likes it here. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you'd asked me a couple of months ago, I'd have probably said still not sure, because we hadn't really seen him, had we? It took till December until he actually made his first championship start. But now he's had a run of games, and he has been impressive. You look at him, and he's a very kind of skinny player, isn't he? You wouldn't have thought he could maybe stand up to the physical challenge, but he has. You can see him sliding into tackles, and obviously he's been shown that he's really good on the ball. And you look at his age, he's 19, so he's only going to get better, isn't he? You'd have thought. So you would think it's an obvious one for Sunderland to do in the summer, out of the loan signings. And if they've got that clause in the contract where they can pay a fee and get kind of first kind of dibs on him with other clubs maybe interested on him, then it seems like an obvious deal to do. But as Phil mentioned before, it does depend on the budget, which we don't know, and what is available in the summer.
Indeed, lots of talk about Ahmad at the moment, Phil, as well. 9 goals for Sunderland this season, and just been an all-round class act, really. Difficult to see him returning to Sunderland on a permanent basis, given the finances and how much Manchester United paid for him. I think it was somewhere in the region of like 25 to 35, 40 million euros, depending on add-ons and various clauses and stuff. I guess the question Sunderland fans want to know is another loan move a slight possibility, or is a Premier League move for Ahmad in the summer probably more likely?
I don't know what the value really for Man United would be in coming back on loan to the Championship. I think that, from their perspective, they've got 2 goals really with Ahmad, haven't they? Or 2 end points, if you like. One is him playing in their team, and the other is them recouping most, if not all, the money that they bought him for. To both of those ends, I'm not sure another loan in the Championship for another year would particularly serve that. If they think he can play in their team but needs another loan, then it's going to have to be at a higher level, isn't it? And if they've got to sell him, then the fee that we're talking about is obviously only going to bring in top-level European clubs, really. Listen, I think he loves it here, and I will chip in a tenner if there's any prospect of getting him back for another year. But unfortunately, I think with Ahmad, it's one of those where let's enjoy him while he's here, and I'm sure we'll all enjoy sort of keeping track of his career as it goes on. And listen, I don't know that for sure, but I'm looking at it from Man United's perspective. I think this loan's worked brilliantly, and who knows, that could be great for Sunderland in the future, because the next time Man United are looking at loaning out one of these incredibly talented players, it'll work hugely in Sunderland's favour. After the difficult loan he had at Rangers, the impact he's made here, reflects really well on Sunderland, and it'll be a big boost for them going forward if they want to do more loan deals. But I don't know. It doesn't strike me that another year in the Championship would work for Man United when it comes to Ahmad.
No, I agree. And at 20 years old, Joe, I actually think Ahmad could go back to Manchester United and make an impact at some point, perhaps, as Phil mentioned, after a loan in the Premier League, or a top European league. I do think he's that good. I think that he's quality. He just possibly needs to add a little bit more consistency and have a little bit more experience playing at the top level. But I think if he stays injury-free, I think he could be a top player.
I think so. I think the form that he showed around Christmas time, he was really kind of head and shoulders above kind of other players in the Championship, wasn't he? We've seen recently perhaps his performance has dropped off a little bit, and I think he picked up a bit of an injury. And Mowbray was talking about the other week perhaps that he's not had this run of games in his career, and he's going to have to get used to that. So that's something that he will have to do if it's at Man United next season, or if he's on loan at another Premier League club. That's something that he'll have to find, is that consistency. But in terms of the talent we've seen at this season, what a good player he is at this level, and you wouldn't have thought they'd have another season in the Championship. You'd think either he's going to be competing for a place at Man United, or they're going to loan him out to whether it be a club lower down in the Premier League, or whether it be abroad somewhere to try and get him more kind of game time at probably a higher level. But the form he showed over Christmas and over that period was excellent, and to see him play was really good, I'm sure, for a lot of some supporters.
Indeed. We were going to talk about general season reflections so far, but we've already gone 30 minutes, to be honest. And if we start on that, we might be another 30 minutes. So I reckon we should probably hold that for later in the international break. We'll come back, perhaps, Phil and Joe, and talk about the season so far and the ups and downs. Otherwise, we'll be here all night.
Yeah, let's do that next week. That's a good idea. Let's do that next week.
Happy
We're all
days.
bored waiting for the Burnley game.
Yeah, I'm sure the powers that be will find us.
It's been brought forward a day, so we've got one less day to fill.
Yeah, true. Right, gents, thank you very much for joining me and for your insight. As usual, you can head over to the Sunderland Echo website for all your latest Sunderland news over the international break and whatnot. And yeah, thank you once again for listening.